I'm calling Daniel from riffninja.com, and this is lesson 3 in a series of 4 on how to boost our knowledge for songwriting and how to use this foundational theory as leverage to get new ideas, right? Now, in the first lesson, we discussed our 2 groups of 1, 4, 5, relative, major, and minor. That applies in any key. Now, lesson number 2 applied to the steps of fifth, which is a good way to get from one key to the next, or to change key and fool the human ear into thinking it all belonged together even though you actually changed key. And because of the distance of the steps of fifth being the way they are and the way we relate to them with our ear, there's no way you're going to hear that key change. It's going to sound super pleasant because each step is a fifth. And as we step through a chord progression of fifth, the next change, if it's always a fifth apart, is always going to sound good to our ear, even though it's dragging us through all these different keys, which is the cool thing about the Hey Joe chord progression. But that chord progression has been around for a long time, right? But it's steps of fifth. Now, what you've got to understand is you've got a lot of knowledge here and a lot of power if you learn how to use it. For example, in any key in music, we've got really technically, I guess we've got 12 different keys in music, right? There's some repeats, like, you have B flat, but you could also call it A sharp. You have F sharp, you could call it G flat or whatever. For some instruments, it's easier to write in one or the other key. So it depends on the instrument. The guitar, it's not preferential to sharps or flats. Usually you use sharps going up and flats going down. But my point to all of this is that in a complete diatonic scale system, which is what our keys are structured on, yeah, there's more notes you can put in that, but I'm talking about the foundation part, right? The basic framework that we need to start with, because all our music works from this and you can't get away from it. It's just the way our system is, right? Okay, so we've got the knowledge now how to figure out the 3 primary majors and the 3 primary minors in any key. That would give us 6 possible chords for any key, right? Well, there are only 7 different notes in a diatonic scale, which completes the key we're in, right? So what we basically got here, when we use the relative major and minor 1, 4, 5, is we have almost the complete chord scale, the complete key, following the notes of the scale in chords. That's what we have, which is great, right? Because that should give us more ideas to how to place the chords in relation to the scale. And here's what I mean. We'll go back to that first lesson where it was G, C, and D is my relative major 1, 4, 5, and E minor, A minor, and B minor is my relative minors for the key of G. Now, if we were in a G major key, the notes would be G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, and G. Those are our 7 notes in the G major scale. You won't find any of the notes in these 6 chords that are outside of this scale. They all belong in the scale, and only the notes in the G major scale have been used to create these 6 chords, right? So they are in the same family. But here's the interesting thing. You can take your chords and put them in scale note order starting from the G. And there's some famous songs that have used that, and some have used it in more subtle ways, and I'll touch on that just before we end this lesson. Okay, so if we've got G, C, and D, and E minor, A minor, and B minor, this is what we could do. We could start with a G major. The next note up in the G major scale is an A. That would mean we'd use an A minor chord. Next note up in the scale would be a B. We'd use the B minor chord, right? Next note up in our scale is the 4, the C, so it has to be C major because we're in the key of G major, right? 5 is going to be D major, and 6 is going to be our relative minor, E minor. So now we have almost a complete scale in chords. G major, A minor, B minor, C major, D major, E minor. Got one note left, G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, and G. That F sharp is what I call the black sheep, and this is something that not a lot of teachers talk about, but I'm going to give you some insight right now, some really important insight. You see, if you study classical theory, they'll tell you that the 7 chord has got to be diminished, but it doesn't have to be diminished. And this is what we're going to deviate from this because we're not playing jazz. You're here because you want to boost your songwriting knowledge, right? and you want to get your options together. Well, this is the place to start. It really is. Okay, so the only chord that we have left to complete the G major scale now is the F sharp. It's going to be an F sharp, but we're not going to play an F sharp diminished. Instead, we're going to substitute it with F sharp minor, which is a common trick to do. It's very common. I'm sure you've heard things like this before. Now in that example, they skipped over the F sharp. Instead of playing a chord, they just played a bass note. But basically it starts on the G, which is either the 1 or the 8. The 8 is the octave, right? So if you call the G 8, then the F sharp is 7, and the E minor, your relative minor, is 6. And that's what they're doing. They're technically doing an 8-7-6 progression. And you'll hear it in different keys, like say A major, right? A major, 1, 4, 5, A, D, and E, relative minor, F sharp minor, B minor, and C sharp minor. Okay, if we put it all together, it goes A major, B minor, C sharp minor, D major, E major, F sharp minor, one more, we got to go a tone for the 7, that's G sharp minor, and A, and that completes our scale. Now, how many times have you heard things like this? So now it was reversed for Tom Petty's Refugee. It was F sharp minor, then the G sharp bass, and then the A. That's a 6, 7, 8 progression, right? So that interplay, by using a bass note to substitute the 7 chord, the 7th note out of the scale, because in A you got A, B, C sharp, D, E, F sharp, G sharp, and then A, right? So G sharp is your 7, right? So if we were going to play a chord, we'd substitute the G sharp diminished, which is really dark, with the G sharp minor, which the classical musician will tell you isn't quite technically correct, but it is. I can prove it later. I just don't want to spend an hour on this in this particular lesson on that. I want you to get these foundational things down first, then the rest of it will make more sense, right? But anyways, the reason why I mentioned this was there's a Bob Marley song called Is This Love? And in it, he does the coolest thing with the scale. He actually goes in reverse, right? And he doesn't, this is a whole deal with it. You don't necessarily have to start on the tonic note in the scale. You know, he actually starts it on the F sharp minor. He's in the key of A major, but he starts on the F sharp minor. And then he goes from F sharp minor to E to D, so he goes backwards in the scale. He goes F sharp minor, E major, D major, C sharp minor, B minor, A. Isn't that cool? And that's found in Is This Love, if you've got a really sharp ear. You know, at the end, when he finishes his chorus, he takes his run back down, that scale run back down from the F sharp. You know, F sharp, E major, D major, C sharp minor, B minor. Next chord is A. There's your tonic. Very cool. Bob Dylan used it in another way. At the very start of this lesson, I played the Bob Dylan progression like a Rolling Stone. And he used the chord scale this way. He went up for the verse from C major to D minor, so it's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, right? Out of C major. You know, remember in C major, you've got C, F, and G, which is your 1, 4, 5. Your relative minor is A minor, D minor, and E minor. Like I said before, there's no law that says you have to use all 6 or the 7th chord that you just learned, the substitution. You don't have, you know, they're used in many different arrangements. And Bob Dylan chose to use the chord scale like this, by going from the 1 chord to the 2 chord to the 3 chord to the 4 chord to the 5, and then holding on to the 5. And then he'll do it again, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Then he sits on the 4 and the 5. There's your 4. Then to the 5. does it one more time. Now guess what he does? He goes down in scale. From the G to the F, to the E minor, to the D minor, to the C. And he does it again. And that brings you into the chorus. But my point was that for the first part of the verse, as he's entering the verse, he went up in scale, using the first chord out of C major, the second chord out of C major, the third, the fourth, and the fifth in scale. And you have to use your proper relative majors and minors. For the C, it's going to be major because you're in the key of C major. For the D, it's going to be a D minor because that's the D is the relative minor 4, right? Because in C major, your relative minor is A minor, D minor, and E minor, right? So it'll go C major, D minor, E minor, F major, G major, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And he does that twice, and he sits on the 4 and 5. Then he comes back down. 4, 3, 2, 1. Does it again. 4, 3, 2, 1. Isn't that cool? So what I'm trying to point out to you is that now you have 3 really good ideas to draw from, and there's a ton of things you can do with it, and I've given you lots of examples. Now start experimenting a bit with these keys, right? You can write out a little chart. You can write it out on your computer, print it out on your computer or whatever, but figure out the 1, 4, 5 relative majors and minors for your basic 7 keys, the key of A major, B majors, all the natural notes, A, B, C, D, F, and G. Figure them out, and then learn to play them on your guitar, and then you're going to open up a lot more to your songwriting. Okay, I'm going to leave you with that. Have fun, and we'll see you later.